preppers. Your Baofeng UV-5R is not going to save you if the shart hits the fan. Okay? And stop asking in ham radio groups which walkie-talkie can communicate 100 miles. They can't. At all. Let's spend a few minutes and clear the airwaves about walkie-talkies, and I'll let you know what is the absolute most important thing to do in terms of communications for emergency preparedness purposes. When people think about walkie-talkies, what they're referring to is simplex communication, right? Radio A to radio B. Straight communicating from one to the other. Simplex communication with VHF, UHF radios is essentially a line of sight mode. Okay, so let's start there. Your standard FRS radios, that's family radio service, right? That's just any old walkie-talkie that anyone can use. They don't require a license, and they operate on 0.5 watts. Your best bet for distance is going to be a couple few miles at the very best. The next step up from FRS radios is what's called GMRS radios. GMRS radios, you're allowed to operate on up to 50 watts on a lot of the same channels as FRS and some additional channels. The caveat with that is when you're talking about handheld radios, walkie-talkies, good luck finding a handheld radio that puts out more than about 10 watts. And even in the realm of ham radios, right? Ham radio operators, if you're licensed for that, you're allowed to operate more than that as far as power is concerned, right? But again, good luck finding a handheld that puts out more than about 10 watts. Okay, so as far as handheld radios are concerned, you're essentially capped to about 10 watts. Now, there are some more advanced things you can do with handheld radios, but that's kind of further deep in the rabbit hole of ham radio, right? This is basic level stuff here. As far as what you can do with 5 or even 10 watts, personally, for me, my longest ever simplex contact was with a 5-watt radio. I was on top of a ridge at about 7,000 foot elevation, and I made contact with somebody down in the valley about 60 miles away. That's absolute ideal circumstances, okay? So again, line of sight, essentially. That brings me to the second point I'm going to make here, which is the height of your antenna matters more so than just about anything else, okay? You can do a heck of a lot more with an antenna way up in the air and low power than you can do with higher power and an antenna sitting on the ground, okay? So when it comes to radio communications, you want your antenna way up as high as you can possibly get it. It's no surprise I could talk 60 miles with somebody when I was basically on top of a mountain and they were down in the valley. That's the best way to increase your range on any type of communications device at all, as far as ham, FRS, GMRS radios, walkie-talkie, whatever you want to call it. Get the antenna up as high as possible. The second way to increase your range is to use what's called repeaters. Repeaters are antennas that are mounted way up on towers, oftentimes, up on hills or mountainsides. Essentially, what a repeater does is it can receive a signal and then spread that out, spread that footprint of that signal and repeat it out to a much larger area. If you can hit the repeater, then your range is essentially as good as the repeater's range. Sometimes that's 50 miles, give or take. So, to go over it again, there's simplex, which is radio A to radio B, right? Just one to the other. And then there's repeaters, which are using this antenna to expand the footprint, expand the reach of the radio signal. There's some websites you can use to find out some great information about radio repeaters. Websites like Repeater Book and Radio Reference are great sites. You can find out all kinds of information about local repeaters. On Radio Reference, you can even find some information for radio frequencies for emergency services, police, fire, railroad, air traffic control, and all kinds of stuff like that. Do not transmit on those frequencies at all, ever. Period. Okay? but they're fun to listen to sometimes. Oftentimes they're trunked and or encrypted, so you're not going to be able to listen to them on your $30, UV-5R. They oftentimes require some specialized equipment to listen to, police in particular, and fire. As far as repeaters are concerned, since we're on the topic of prepping, right? So many people are buying radios for prepping, and for whatever reason, the internet is telling everyone to buy a Baofeng UV-5R. Okay. Again, at the very best, your handheld radios are going to be putting out 10 watts. You're going to be fairly limited. And even if you're using a repeater, even if you have a license for GMRS, ham radio, or whatever, if the SHTF hits the fan, okay, the repeater may or may not be operational. It all depends what happens, right? So if during a natural disaster, a tower becomes physically damaged, right, like let's say a tornado or an earthquake or whatever the case, right, or even say a giant solar flare or EMP fries the repeater software, okay, then that repeater is no longer any good to you. The thing with repeaters, though, is your transmission is being publicly broadcast to the entire footprint of whomever is within the range of listening to the repeater. That being said, with any FRS, GMRS, or ham radio, the same is also true. Basically, it doesn't matter what what mode you're using, ham, GMRS, or FRS radio, people can potentially hear you. So security-wise, there's that. Again, there are some more advanced things you can do with ham radio, GMRS, and all that, but that's a little bit further deep down the rabbit hole. One of the other things you can do to try to increase your range, say if you're trying to talk to somebody who's, let's say, 25 or 30 miles away, that's possible. Like I said, what matters the most is getting your antenna as high up as possible, right? Whichever way you want to go about that. The other way to do that is to increase your transmit power. A mobile radio, for instance, a radio that is designed to be installed in your car, some of these radios can put out 25 or even 50 watts if you're licensed as a ham or a GMRS operator. Okay, those radios don't necessarily have to be installed in your vehicle, although they can. You can also use it in your home as a base station. Now, going from 5 or 10 watts to 25 or 50 is a big increase in power. With an antenna high enough in the air, using UHF, VHF frequencies, talking to somebody else who's got an antenna high up in the air, you can usually get a good 25 plus miles out of communication. If you're on one side of a mountain and the person that you're trying to talk to is on the complete opposite side of the mountain, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to use any type of UHF or VHF frequencies to talk to them, simplex-wise. Now, if there's a repeater on top, that's different. You can use the repeater to bounce the signal back and forth and talk to each other. But again, repeater may or may not be available to you. So we're thinking in terms of emergency communication. Now, a lot of people will say, the FCC isn't going to come bang on your door if the SHTF hits the fan. They're not going to be out there policing people who are unauthorized to use particular radio frequencies. And you're correct. They probably won't be. However, the point that I want to drive home here is if you're buying radios for emergency preparedness purposes, they don't do you any good if you're not using them, if you're not very well versed in exactly what they can do for you and how to do that with them. Don't buy radios if you're not going to spend any effort into learning how they work. If you're not going to put any effort into it, just go buy some bubble pack walkie-talkies and talk to your neighbors, okay? Because that's about as far as you're going to get as far as radio knowledge is concerned.